I love roller coasters, but when I'm free falling, right, my heart still drops and like I feel scared. So like there are going to be those moments as a teenager where you're literally free falling.
Okay, so welcome to the second episode of Reality Check podcast, and we have Rabbi Fogel, principal, middle school of Haub, and something that impresses all of us with Rabbi Fogel, and specifically because he's a principal, that he deals with mental health as well as all the other things that pertain to a job for a principal. And we see kids coming in and out of your office all the time, talking about serious things, you helping them, giving them guidance. Can you tell us what you feel a principal's role in regards to mental health?
So first of all, thank you for having me here. I think this is great, so thanks for doing it and also letting me participate in it. I think, what used to seem as two very separate areas of education and psychology, two different areas, two different fields in the world, was that a student came to school to learn, and if they had any issues, they would deal with that at a school, whether it was with a therapist or with their parents. But when they're in school, they dealt specifically with their academics, and then when they were out of school, they would deal with life. And I think what the trend now, and I think it's the right thing to do, is to really see each child coming into school every single day as a full child, seeing the whole child, not just the academic piece. And I think logically it makes sense, because if a kid, I remember once walking into a 6th grade girls class because the Mora had texted me there was an accident on Peninsula Boulevard and she was stuck behind this big oil tanker, and she's like, I'm not going to be there on time. I run into the classroom and this girl is in the classroom and her head is down and she's crying. And I said, what's wrong? And she's like, well, my parents just got a brand new, my mother just had a baby a few days ago and she got a brand new car, and we picked up Dunkin' on our way to school and my hot chocolate spilled in her brand new car and she literally lost it. And this girl came in with all that on her shoulders. Her mother, who just had a baby, was trying to be super nice to her, take her to Dunkin' on her way to school, and now she just spilled hot chocolate over her mother's brand new car. That's how she came to school. She wasn't ready to learn. And the reason she wasn't ready to learn was because she had a lot on her head that morning. And I think educators now realize that we can't do it alone, which is why we have people like yourself and different professional, social emotional classes involved in our curriculum, because we're starting to realize that students don't just come to school to learn, they come to school to also grow and become better people, and they can't do one without the other. And that's, I think, the intersect between psychology and education. The school that I went to was actually a school that focused on clinical psychology, but it was actually in a school called Teachers College, because their education and their psychology classes are so close to each other that a lot of the classes overlap, and you're taking education professors while you're in a psychology track, and you're taking psychology classes while you're in an education track. And I think that's really how we at Haub see it, and I think that is the right way to go forward.
How many times do you see a kid going through something where you see his grades going down, you start asking questions, start realizing there's something going on in his life, and it interrelates? Do you find that often?
Yeah, I think the number one, most kids that are going through challenges in life don't actually realize that they're going through a challenge until it's usually too late. One of the earliest indicators that a child or a parent has that their child is going through something is when they start to see their grades decline, when they start to see their happiness in school decline. When a kid suddenly comes home and says, I hate school, my first recommendation to a parent would be to sit down with the kid and say, what's happening? What's going on? Because there's a lot more. No kid suddenly, starts to just fail. Kids don't like to fail. Kids don't like to not do well. Every person in the world wants to be successful, right? The easiest example is everybody wants to be a millionaire, right? Everybody wants to make millions. And every kid realizes that if they would do well in school and if they were successful, they would have the opportunity. Not everybody defines success as being a millionaire, but everybody wants to have more and at least have the opportunity to. So there's no kid that sort of wakes up in the morning and says, okay, I want to figure out how I could really, really take my potential success later on in life, not do well, most kids wake up and they want to do well. And if they're not, something's going on. So the earliest indicator for a parent or a kid that something's going on in their life that they need to potentially work on and deal with is that they're not doing as well as they could in school, or that they're not happy enough in school.
That's great.
Do you think the challenges today that the students struggle with existed 10 to 15 years ago? Are they still nowadays?
It's such a great question, because I think every generation thinks that their challenges are like the challenge to like educators and their challenge to the world, and nobody ever had to face it. What I've found is that it's actually the same stuff, just packaged very differently. You know, in the early 1900s, there was an article. I read this book. I was very bored one day, and I read a book about the Wright brothers. You know what the Wright brothers did before they invented planes? They actually had a bike store. And there was an article, I don't remember what paper it was in, but there's an article in the paper that basically said that bicycles are going to destroy society. You know why? Because everybody in those days lived in a certain community, right? So if you lived in one, you chose to raise your children in one community, they were limited, their exposure was limited to the community that you lived in, right? They weren't able to go to the next community and be influenced in a negative way from the next community. But bicycles are bad. You know why bicycles are bad? Because if you're a kid in this community, you're now able to bike over on your own. You didn't have to ask your parents to drive you to the next community. You're now able to go to the next community and expose yourself to who knows what. And the article was basically claiming, and as I'm sitting there, this is about 5 years ago, I'm reading this article while in my head I'm reading and I'm hearing all about technology. Technology is disaster. It's killing children. It's literally going to be the end of society. And I'm thinking to myself, if I took this article about bicycles in the 1920s and I took out the word bicycle and I inserted the word technology, it's the same concern of parents, right? It's that you're holding access to exposure to the whole world. Now, I do think that there's a new face to the challenge, and it's different, but it's the same challenge. The reality is that children are growing up too fast, and parents want to hold them back and want to try to guide their growth and their development in a more structured way. And the outside world has a way of finding its way to influence, and all those things that you as a parent don't want your kids to know about, that's what the world is going to make sure your kids know about. So whether it was 100 years ago and you were now able to bike over to the convenience store and perhaps pick up a magazine or something that your parents didn't really want you to pick up, today you have it in your hand. It's a different challenge. The accessibility of all those challenges may be what changed over time. Meaning it used to be you had to, go into that store, you had to do something, you had to maybe sneak it, and people could have caught you along the way. Today, it's right here in your hand. So maybe things are more accessible, so it's a little bit more of a challenge. But in general, I do think that most challenges are the same today than they were in the past. They're just dressed very differently.
We've seen you keep many relationships with your past students, even many years after they graduate. From your experience, what do you see as an important factor for students to succeed in the future?
Very good question. I think there are a lot of factors, but I think a close relationship with a Rabbi, or, I have a student who has an amazing relationship with his grandfather. Like one of the closest relationships I've ever seen somebody have with their grandfather, and his grandfather's his mentor. When you have an adult, when you're, I'll phrase it a different way. When you as a child are willing to give up control and recognize that there are people with a lot more life experience and education and wisdom, and you're open to get and hear that wisdom from those people, then you're going to be successful in life. But when you're closed and you think, my 6th, 7th, or 8th grade mind, or 10th, 11th grade mind, I know the answers to the world challenges, I know how to live my life with the limited, right? Your brain is not even fully developed, right? So the decisions that you're making, right, are all lacking the full picture of the world. But when you have a person who has either been trained, like a psychologist, a therapist, who has been trained to see the world in a certain view, or a Rebbe, a rabbi, any mentor, a grandfather, or even a parent, if you have somebody in your life that you recognize that they know more and you go for guidance, then I think you're most likely to be successful.
Can you elaborate on the importance of helping each student find their strengths and talents aside from educational achievements?
I think that is the key of education. Not everybody, I hated math as a kid. I hated math. But as I got older, I loved psychology. I had an amazing relationship with a therapist that my parents took me to. And when I was in 11th grade, I remember thinking he was actually a psychiatrist, and he practiced psychology. So he had a practice. He didn't practice medicine, but he was a psychiatrist. And I remember saying, that's what I want to do, right? And I never thought that when I got to school, I would have to learn statistics. One of the major areas of study for psychologists is research, and that involves a lot of statistics, right? So I showed up there, and I was like, why do I want to know statistics? I don't want to know statistics. I don't care about statistics. I hate statistics. It's so annoying, right? But when I worked very hard and I started, thank God I had a background from school where I learned a little bit of math and I paid a little bit of attention to math so that when I had to learn it, I had that foundation to build on it. But every single person, every single kid has something that they love, that they are passionate about, and they're going to want to develop that. And if they're able to tap into that, they'll be really good at it, right? I have a student who sounds crazy, but he loves comics. He has a whole collection. He spends every cent he has. He's at NYU now. He's graduating, and he's going to be working for Disney, and he's going to be doing comics, and I don't know what he's doing, whatever stuff he's doing. I have another student who loved movies. Right? He's working for HBO, but he couldn't have gotten to where he wanted to develop that raw talent without also having that foundation of stuff. I have a student who loves sports. So you know what he does? He actually went to Harvard, graduated, went to Harvard undergrad, and he works for ESPN, I think.
That's cool.
Yeah, and what does he do? He does the finance part behind sports. We don't realize that there's a lot of money, right? Although sports teams want us to love the sport and love their players and love their talent, but they also want to make a lot of money off of us. Okay, if they can't make money off of us and they can't pay their players millions of dollars, like we saw this year in baseball, they won't play because it's about us, but it's not totally about us. It's also about the money that they're making off the teams, right? So he loved sports. He's a diehard sports fan, and he found a way to take that talent that he has, but he also needed the foundation of a formal education to get there, So I think it's very important for children to recognize their personal talent that they connect with, that they love, and they should never forget that. But I think it's also important to give them a foundation in their education so that later on top of that foundation, they could now build their personal love for whatever they're going to do and build it.
What is your view on therapy, and at what point do you feel someone should entertain that idea?
So I happen to think in my life, one of the people that had the biggest impact was when I was in 11th or 12th grade. My parents took me to Dr. Tversky. And again, I wasn't falling apart as a kid, but I needed somebody to talk to, and I have gone back to Dr. Tversky even as a professional to get advice, and when I had to make some very, very big decisions, I developed a relationship with him that I could go and get advice from him. And that's very powerful when you have a person in your life that is not, emotionally attached to you and your life. So he's a professional. You're going to him as a professional, and he's somebody that comes with a lot of experience, has seen all the good and all the bad. But I also feel that it's not enough to just have that. I think it's also very important to have, like when we started our conversation with, which is a Rabbi. The people, my wife always says that when we were dating, I took her to see all my Rebbeim. And I had so many Rebbeim that she was like, you got to pick somebody because it's just too much. It's too many of them. But I think Rebbeim were the most impactful in helping me and guiding me. And the person that my parents took me to, although it doesn't have to be, but I went to, he happens to be a Harvard graduate, Dr. Tversky, but when you meet him, he looks like a Rebbe. He's got a long beard, he wears a Hasidish hat, and he's a Harvard graduate. He's a brilliant man, but at the same time, he was able to sort of bring both of those worlds together, right? Meaning that today, most rabbis getting their smicha also have an education in a mental health field. Like a lot of rabbis, like YU has part of their smicha program, they take certain social work classes because they really go hand in hand. And if you really want to have an impact on people, you need to be able to deal with them, and you have to understand them from a social, emotional, a psychological perspective, not just from, and just to think about Torah, 99% of Torah is climbing into a person's, psychology, into their character. And you think about every sefer across the board from davening, right? We start davening, right? First words we say, Moda'ani, is to be thankful, right? Think about positive psychology, right? It's written all over davening. Your entire davening is about recognizing the goodness you have. This morning we talked about saying Asher Yatzar. Could you imagine a person let's say you're a depressed person, right? And 5 times a day you stopped and you were thankful for your health, right? You're automatically, your brain, right? The neurotransmitters in your brain are lighting up with positivity. And one act of positive makes more, and it brings on more, and it brings on more. So I think they really go hand in hand, like Torah and psychology go really, really hand in hand. It's no coincidence that the first psychologist sort of stole his theory, like the Yetzer Tov Yetzer Hara. Like, duh, we've been talking about that for the last 3,000 years. Like, you could give Sigmund Freud, right? You could give Sigmund Freud credit for it, but it really goes hand in hand. So I think it's never a bad thing to go to a therapist. And I'll leave you with one very important point. I think this is like one of the most important points. Most people wait until there's like a crisis to go to a therapist. You know what the problem is? You show up at the therapist in crisis mode. It takes a long time to make any change in your life. Right? The Vilna Gaon says it could take an entire lifetime to change one midah, one characteristic. Right? So you show up to the therapist when the parents are ready to strangle their kid and the kid is ready to strangle their parents. And you sit down in front of the therapist and you start talking, and the session's over in a little bit, right? Because the therapist has a life beyond your issues also, right? So you sit down, you tell the therapist all your problems, and then the session's over. Now you're going home and you have a week until your next session, right? You can't just wake up and try to get somebody involved in your life when you're in crisis, because you're in crisis mode, right? So I do think it's very beneficial for children and parents, especially during the teenage years, to have a relationship with a professional, a Rabbi, a social worker, somebody that if a crisis were to come up, they would have somebody to go to. And it wouldn't necessarily be kid versus parent ready to kill each other in that intense crisis moment.
It's interesting. I like middle school, working with middle school kids, because it's before a lot of times they're into crisis. Sometimes 10th, 11th grade, they're already in that hole, and it's very hard. And a lot of times, a lot of the society tells us, okay, we got to help the kids at risk, but help them before they get there, before they're...
100%. Rabbi Storch always makes fun of me. He says, you get them before they're real teenagers. That's why they like you so much. And there's truth to that.
Yeah, sure.
There's truth
Naive.
To that. Because Rabbi Kamenetsky always says, high school is like a roller coaster. It's like, there's going to be an end to the crazy ride. I love roller coasters, but when I'm free falling, right, my heart still drops, and I feel scared. So like there are going to be those moments as a teenager where you're literally free falling and your heart just drops. But if you have that foundation, if you have that track behind you, that seat that you're sitting on, and you're buckled in, and you know you're not falling out, it's not so hard to pick up your hands and say, okay, feels like I'm falling right now, but it's okay.
It's great.
It's okay, I'm holding on. You
I
know?
think you actually predicted the next question, but segue into the next question.
How do you feel that Torah and psychology relate?
So we just talked about it a little bit. I think, last night I was learning with somebody he actually lives in Miami. He's not religious, and he's getting married. He called me to learn before he got married, and I asked him. I said, and I asked him if he plans on living like religiously post his marriage, and he said no. I said, so I'm just curious, like, why did you reach out? And he said, the one thing, he actually grew up in this community. He says, the one thing I love about Judaism, the only thing I love about Judaism, he said, he had a very challenging life and a lot of difficult experiences, but he said, the one thing I love about Judaism is the restrictions. I'm like, that sounds pretty crazy because you're not a religious person, so why do you love the restrictions? He said, I know. He said, but, he said, I learned self-control. He's a very successful, he worked for Uber for many years. He said, I learned self-control from my Judaism. And he said, there's a difference between people that have success and not success. If you have self-control, and psychologists today know that self-control is a muscle that you build, right? Many years ago at Harvard, they did a study, I think it was at Harvard, Dr. Ash, right, with the marshmallow effect. I think it was at Harvard. They offered children, you could have one marshmallow now, or you could have two marshmallows in like an hour, right? And the kids that chose, little kids that chose to have two marshmallows later as opposed to one marshmallow now, they're the same people that are able to look at a market, right? A whole spread, a screen of the trend of a market and say, I just lost $50 million in the market. I'm good. I'm not pulling all my money out because I know that the larger trend of the market is going to go up. I'm able to handle a loss right now. It's called delaying gratification, right? Most of the reason that middle schoolers, right, don't become successful later on in life, it's because they can't delay gratification, right? That movie that you want to watch tonight, or that game that you want to watch on TV, is not going to make you a better life later on. It's just not, factually. It won't. What will? Sitting down and doing your homework, right? But you can't delay the gratification. You can't say, I'm going to wait till next Sunday after my test to watch that movie or go to a sports game. I want to do it now. So, in a weird way, a person who practices Torah, mitzvos, will automatically be a more successful person because you spent your entire life building up that muscle of delaying your gratification. I don't need to have that pleasure now. Oh, I just had meat. I could wait 6 hours for that ice cream. I don't need to eat that ice cream right now. Oh, it's Shabbos. I can't go swimming today. I'll go swimming tomorrow. The entire Torah is built on creating that. Another thing, you think about character, right? Lashon Hara, right? If you literally want to end up in the depths of hell, like the biggest of fires, talk Lashon Hara, right? It's the most evil thing from the whole Torah. People would think, right? Like adultery, stealing, not keeping Shabbos. No. The most negative commandments, the biggest no-no you could do from the entire Torah, basically, speaking Lashon Hara, talking bad about another person. So if you're a person who doesn't speak negatively about other people, you know what that naturally does to you, to your self-esteem? Why do people talk about other people?
Because they're jealous.
Yeah,
Putting people down.
Right. I want to put you down. Because when I put you down, it makes me
Makes
better.
me feel better, yeah.
Right. So when you actually start to, and I'm just giving you two examples, but this example of lashon hara, right? Or humility, right? Moshe Rabbeinu was anav mikol adam, right? He was the most humble person, right? If you start living and practicing Torah, you're just going to become the best person ever, right? We're learning in the daf the whole Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, right? Why do we paskin like Beis Hillel over Beis Shammai? Because Beis Hillel always listened to Beis Shammai's argument first. If you look in the entire Gemara, the entire Mishnah, who's listed first? Beis Shammai, then Beis Hillel. Why? Because that's how Beis Hillel always had it happen. So when you're the kind of person that, lives your life in the right way, you could turn into Reb Chaim Kanievsky and have 1 million people show up at your funeral. And hundreds of millions of people around the world here and are affected by your loss. And none of them are saying, oh, he's a horrible person. He did this wrong. He did that wrong. No. You know why? Because the Torah, by default, will set you up for a good, healthy, happy life. You're going to see the good in other people. You're not going to speak lashon hara, right? And therefore, it sort of goes hand in hand with psychology, because if a psychologist could literally design for you a perfect life, it would be the life of the Torah.
It's amazing. Thank you. Just last question, just to sum everything up. A lot of things we spoke about, even the marshmallow study, they've proven that, and then they did the studies years later, and they saw the people who were successful delaying their gratification, later on, better marriages, better in their
CEOs,
job,
right?
became CEOs. So what message would you give to students now? Now they're hearing this, they're inspired. Mental health is important. Self-control is important. What can they do now to be able to gain these skills and tips?
So I think this is fresh in my mind because I was just learning this in the Archas Tzadikim. I think humility is the key. If you're open, if you don't think you have all the answers in life, as a kid, you probably don't. Even as an adult, as someone my age, I know I don't. I have a coach that I talk to for my leadership questions. I have Rabbi that I talk to. When you're able to realize that you don't have all the answers, you will be open to hear great news and great advice and great guidance, and you'll be more successful. And more than that, you won't feel bad about yourself, because when you don't have the right answer, you won't beat yourself up, because you're not supposed to always have the right answer. So I think if you just open yourself up and say, I'm not closed, I don't know everything, I don't have the answer to everything, and I want to learn more, I want to grow more, then I think every kid has the opportunity to learn and be very successful.
This was incredible. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.